Imagine standing barefoot on cold stone, your wrists bound, your breath echoing off walls that have swallowed the screams of queens and noblewomen before you. The executioner sharpens his blade just beyond your sight, but you can hear the steel scraping, slow and deliberate, like a promise being carved into the morning air. This is Tower Green, and if you're a woman who's ended up here, you've already lost everything. Your name, your family, your future. All that's left is the question of whether the axe will be sharp enough to take your head in one clean swing, or whether you'll become another bloody mistake etched into England's most notorious killing ground. Welcome to the Tower of London, where highborn ladies didn't just lose their lives, they lost them in the most calculated, humiliating, and occasionally botched ways imaginable. And the truly disturbing part? Most of them never committed the crimes they died for. They were simply too dangerous to keep alive, too politically inconvenient, too connected to the wrong bloodline or the wrong man or the wrong god. The tower wasn't built as a slaughterhouse. William the Conqueror raised these walls in the 1070s as a fortress, a statement in stone that screamed power and permanence. It was meant to terrify Londoners into submission, and it worked. Over the centuries, it became a palace, a treasury, a zoo at one point, believe it or not, and eventually a prison for those whose crimes were too sensitive for public spectacle. By the Tudor era, the tower had evolved into something far darker, a stage where monarchy performed its most intimate acts of violence. Executions here weren't about justice, they were about control. And the women who died within these walls weren't common criminals dragged before crowds at Tower Hill. They were wives, daughters, cousins of kings, women whose blood was too blue, whose influence too threatening, whose mere existence could spark rebellion or cast doubt on a king's legitimacy. So they were silenced, permanently, in a space where no crowds could cheer or jeer, where history could be written by the survivors. Let's start with Lady Jane Grey, the girl who never wanted to be queen but became one anyway, for exactly 9 days. Jane was 16 years old, bookish, devout, fluent in multiple languages, and completely out of her depth. When King Edward VI, the sickly Protestant son of Henry VIII, lay dying in 1553, a group of power-hungry nobles decided they couldn't stomach the idea of his half-sister Mary, a Catholic, taking the throne. So they shoved Jane forward like a sacrificial lamb dressed in royal robes. She wept when they told her she was queen. She begged them to reconsider. But her father-in-law, the Duke of Northumberland, wasn't interested in her feelings. He was interested in keeping Protestants in power and himself close to it. Jane's reign lasted 9 days before Mary Tudor, backed by popular support and a legitimate claim, marched into London and had Jane arrested. At first, Mary seemed inclined toward mercy. Jane was just a pawn, after all. But then Sir Thomas Wyatt led a rebellion in early 1554, trying to put Jane back on the throne. Jane had nothing to do with it. She was locked in the tower, praying and reading scripture, completely unaware of the chaos erupting in her name. But her existence, her bloodline, her claim, however reluctant, made her too dangerous to spare. On February 12, 1554, Jane was led to Tower Green. She wore black. She carried a prayer book. Witnesses said she was composed, eerily calm, as if she'd already made peace with what was about to happen. She gave a short speech, admitting that she had acted unlawfully in accepting the crown but insisting she had never wanted it. Then came the blindfold. And this is where the scene turns from tragic to nightmarish. Blindfolded, Jane couldn't find the block. She groped around in the dark, her hands searching the empty air, her voice rising in panic. "What shall I do? Where is it?" Someone in the crowd had to guide her hands to the wood. She knelt. She placed her neck on the block, and the axe fell. One swing. Clean. Efficient. The 9-day queen was gone, and England moved on as if she'd never existed. But Jane's death set a precedent. It told the world that innocence was no defense, that youth was no shield, and that the Tower would devour anyone the crown deemed expendable. Now, let's talk about Margaret Pole, Countess of Salisbury, whose execution was so horrifically bungled that even hardened Tudor officials reportedly looked away. Margaret was old, probably in her late 60s, when they dragged her to the block. She was also innocent. But innocence, as we've established, meant absolutely nothing. Margaret's crime was being born into the wrong family. She was the daughter of George, Duke of Clarence, which made her Plantagenet royalty, a living relic of the dynasty Henry VII had overthrown to establish Tudor rule. For most of her life, she'd been useful to the Tudors. She served as governess to Princess Mary, was granted lands and titles, and lived quietly. But then her son, Reginald Pole, a Catholic cardinal living safely in Rome, published a scathing attack on Henry VIII, calling him a schismatic tyrant and questioning his right to break with the Catholic Church. Henry, never one for proportional responses, decided that if he couldn't reach Reginald, he'd destroy his mother instead. In 1538, Margaret was arrested. No trial, no formal charges, just imprisonment, cold and indefinite, in the Tower. She stayed there for nearly 3 years, alone, elderly, probably wondering if they'd simply let her rot. They didn't. On May 27, 1541, she was told it was time. According to contemporary accounts, Margaret refused to cooperate. She wouldn't kneel. She wouldn't lay her head on the block. She declared she was no traitor and demanded to know what law condemned her. The executioner, inexperienced and likely nervous, tried to force the issue. What happened next is almost too grotesque to believe, but multiple sources confirm it. He swung the axe. He missed. He hit her shoulder. She screamed, tried to run, and he chased her around the scaffold, hacking at her neck, her back, her head, until she finally collapsed. It took 11 blows, some accounts say more, to kill her. The crowd, small and controlled as it was, stood in horrified silence. Even the guards, used to violence, seemed shaken. Margaret Pole's execution wasn't a mistake. It was a massacre disguised as justice, and it sent a message louder than any royal proclamation. No one, not even a frail old woman of royal blood, was beyond the reach of Henry's wrath. But if you think Margaret's death was the worst the Tower had to offer, let me introduce you to Anne Askew, the woman who endured what no other noblewoman in England ever had: torture on the rack. Anne wasn't royalty. She wasn't a queen or a countess, but she was educated, outspoken, and Protestant in an England that was violently divided over faith. She read the Bible, which was still controversial. She preached, which was forbidden for women. She distributed banned Protestant texts, which was treasonous. In 1545, she was arrested, questioned, and released. But a year later, they came for her again. This time, the interrogators were determined to extract names. Who else was involved in spreading Protestant ideas? Who, in the royal court, secretly sympathized with reform? Anne refused to talk. So they took her to the Tower and strapped her to the rack, a wooden frame designed to slowly pull the body apart at the joints. The ropes tightened. Her shoulders dislocated. Her hips separated. She screamed until her voice gave out. And still, she said nothing. By the time they were done, Anne couldn't walk. She couldn't stand. Her body was so broken that when they carried her to Smithfield to be burned alive on July 16, 1546, she had to be tied to a chair and hoisted onto the pyre. Witnesses said she remained silent as the flames rose, her face set in grim determination. A bag of gunpowder had been tied around her neck to speed her death, a small mercy in an ocean of cruelty. Anne Askew died because she believed women had the right to read Scripture. That was her crime, and the men who tortured and killed her did so in the name of God and King, convinced they were saving England from heresy. Finally, there's Catherine Howard, the teenage bride who became Henry VIII's fifth wife and his next victim. Catherine was maybe 17 when she married the king, a man in his late 40s, obese, ulcerated, and increasingly paranoid. She was pretty, flirtatious, and tragically naive. Her family pushed her toward the throne, hoping to secure their influence. But Catherine had a past. Before her marriage, she'd been involved with a music teacher, possibly others. At court, she may have rekindled a relationship with Thomas Culpeper, a royal favorite. When rumors reached Henry, his fury was apocalyptic. Catherine was arrested in November 1541 and imprisoned in the Tower. She was never tried. Her fate was decided by Parliament through a Bill of Attainder, a legal shortcut that allowed execution without trial. On February 13, 1542, Catherine was led to Tower Green. Some say she practiced laying her head on the block the night before, rehearsing her own death like an actor preparing for a final performance. She wore a black gown. She made no speech, and when the axe fell, England lost another queen to a king's insecurity and rage. These women, Jane, Margaret, Anne, Catherine, didn't die because they were guilty. They died because they were inconvenient, because their blood, or beliefs, or beauty made them targets in a system where survival depended on a monarch's mood. The Tower of London didn't just execute them. It erased them, reducing their lives to cautionary tales whispered in the shadows of power.